Recording going, and back to our look at evolution, which will today go on to explore evolutionary patterns now that we've seen sort of the basics of natural history. And one of the big patterns, which will continue through Wednesday in terms of the fundamentals and then throughout the rest of the course, which is going to be phylogenetics, reconstructing the pattern of evolution. So I ended with this one last time, and we saw this issue of, the origin of a species is a process, it's not a moment, and at any given time in the history of parents and offspring, you don't have a parent that's a member of one species and an offspring that's a member of a different one. It's only from the long view that we see these distinctions. So this is yet another case where species have fuzzy boundaries. Not only do they have fuzzy boundaries at any given time slice, but also through time. Now, an important aspect of evolution is that unlike the pre-modern thinkers, before Darwin and Wallace, where people really did think that transmutationism only went from simple to complex, that's not the way evolution works. Evolution works in all kinds of fashions. Selection, so natural selection, only operates among the variations available at any given time. So you've got variations in a population, and based on the response from ecology, that is survival and reproduction, some of them will do better, and some will do worse, and the ones that do better have a better chance of having offspring. Now, sometimes it might be a more complex form in some context that survives, and indeed, without this attribute, we'd all still be single-celled, bacterial-grade organisms. But sometimes simpler variation is more successful by some metric. For instance, most endoparasites, parasites that live inside another organism, have ectoparasite or even non-parasite ancestors that live outside the organism. But when they become adapted to a lifestyle inside other organisms, things like sense organs and limbs and so forth become a lot less important, and those variants that have reduced features in that context do better. Or similarly, cave fish that lose their eyes. In that context, they're simpler than their outside-dwelling eyed ancestors. Or, as we'll see in a couple weeks, actually next week, the origin of dinosaurs and their kin involves a simplification of the ankle, a reduction of the ankle to basically a hinge-like structure rather than the more complex ankle that we and many other vertebrates like lizards and so forth retain, where we have motion in many different planes. Or really the most common case is that the descendant has only the same complexity, so no more or less complex than the ancestor. It's simply different. Now, a famous phrase associated with Darwin and with natural selection is survival of the fittest, and many people are surprised to learn that Darwin himself didn't use this phrase until the 6th and last edition of The Origin. He did not coin it. It was actually developed by this guy, Herbert Spencer, so you can see his dates, a contemporary of Darwin and Wallace, who was a real polymath, a biologist, a philosopher, a political theorist, and more. And what happened with Spencer is he looked at The Origin and saw in it something on a grander scale than Darwin was talking about. So Darwin was talking about, the origin of biological diversity. And Spencer thought we could express this concept of success versus failure among competitors in some sort of sphere in many different fields, like corporations in an economy, not just species in an ecology, or even philosophies within the noosphere, the sphere of the mind. And so he coined this term, survival of the fittest. Now, it's not a bad phrase, I suppose, so long as we don't overly associate the word fittest there with, or fitness, which is its related word, with physical fitness. In nature, fitness doesn't mean better, stronger, faster, the Olympian ideals or whatever. fitness is simply how apt you are to that environment. How do you fit into that environment? And it's expressed relative to other members of your population. And it is tested versus your reproductive success. That's how we evaluate fitness. Not the number of push-ups you can do, not your IQ, but the number of offspring you produce. That's the key. Because that is the coin of evolution. Do you have descendants? So from an organism's point of view, technically, reproductive success is measured in more offspring. But if you want to take a different view, and sometimes, as we'll see when we talk about behavior in the third section of the course, sometimes taking the point of view of an allele rather than a whole organism is very effective. We'll see that the idea of making more copies of yourself into the next generation of individuals is better. Now, you might think these are the same thing, but they're not always. For instance, your siblings and other close relatives will have many of the same alleles you do. So the evolution of behaviors, where it promotes behaviors where you help support the survival of your cousins or your nephews and nieces, even maybe at the expense of yourself, might result in more copies of your alleles in the next generation, and therefore can be naturally selected. We'll talk more about that and the evolution of altruism later in the course. But remember that natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction. It's not merely survival that's important. If you survive but fail to produce offspring, either directly or indirectly by supporting your siblings, then it doesn't matter. That's not evolution. So there is a whole sphere of natural selection. Some people try to make a big deal about this being distinct from natural selection. I'm not one of them. I think this is a variation on it, or a subset. And that's called sexual selection. And that's the evolution of traits, some of which might actually be deleterious to the survival of the individual. But they can be favored. Evolution for these traits can be favored if the possession of these traits results in increased reproductive success. So having them might reduce your ability to survive relative to conditions if you didn't have them. But if the net result is you're going to have more offspring than those that don't have that trait, that's again the coin of selection. So, classic example, the tail of a peacock. Now the tail of the peacock is not, the males have, females don't. The peafowl, if you want to say the species as a whole, peacock and peahen for male and female if you care about these things. The peacock's fan is not always as a fan. It only does that to display to the females during the reproductive part of the year, during the breeding season. Otherwise, it's this long tail hanging out behind them. And I suspect a peacock running through the jungle, being chased by a tiger or a leopard, might think it would be cool if I didn't have this long thing giving away my presence, if I had a short stubby tail, and, it might increase my chance of surviving while running through the wilderness. But when it comes breeding season, if you had a short little stubby tail and you get out on the dance floor, which is what happens. They're called leks, but leks are just dance floors in nature. And you go, meh. And you got this tiny little fan, no female's going to mate with you. But if you come there exhausted, then you go, boom, this huge fan, and oh boy, that really gets the peahens going, and you've got another generation. And you can keep on exaggerating such features so long as the net result is increased reproductive success for less of that feature. Eventually, there will be a threshold where, no, that's not going to be successful, and you'll actually have a decreased reproductive success, and that will show you the limits for that trait. And it's not just particular traits, it might be behaviors as well. So a common aspect of combat, of within species combat, is to display in a situation that the mates, the potential mates, can judge your worthiness. And again, they're not sitting back and consciously thinking about it as such. Natural selection has evolved behaviors where they preferentially would mate with the winners rather than the losers of these competitions. And just to show you other examples, maybe a little less violent. So here are male frigate birds that I took pictures of. They don't normally have these enormous air sacs inflated. And in fact, when they're not inflated, they are among the most aerodynamic birds out there. They're really wonderful. Steal the fish from other birds in midair and so forth. But in order to mate, the males have to blow up these big sacs. And go, woo, that's the sound, woo, as the females are flying over. And if they didn't have them, they're not going to have any offspring. But while these things are inflated, and they don't always deflate quickly, it decreases their aerodynamic ability, and so it actually is slightly detrimental to them in feeding during the breeding season. And sometimes it's a lot less dramatic than that. So here I took pictures of a blue-footed booby male dancing to the female. And if you don't have the good feet and you don't have the moves, you don't get the girl. There are reasons why displays tend to be on the part of males to females. We'll get to that in the third section of the course, and it has to do with basically the amount of sex cells available from one sex versus the other. So sexual selection is nature saying, it's fine, it doesn't matter if I also attract every predator, misspelled, for miles. Unless it doesn't if you have, at least if you've got increased reproductive success in the end, or it's a strange moment when you realize that the sound of nature is the sound of millions of animals, birds, and insects, or birds and insects are animals, desperately trying to get laid. Really, it is. That's what nature's all about. So, many of these ideas, even the idea of sexual selection, or at least a version of it, was available to people like Erasmus Darwin, like Charles Darwin's granddad. And yet those earlier people didn't get to natural selection. And yet Darwin and Wallace did. And part of the reason was Charles Darwin and Wallace, were working at a time when the geologists had opened up the scope of geologic time. They had discovered that the scale of Earth history wasn't thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, but was hundreds of millions or billions of years. And so, given that scale, slight changes in the percentages of traits from one generation to the next could now accumulate over the vastness of geologic time to produce great changes. And so here, one nice thing about early researchers is they had physical notebooks that have survived to this day, and we can see their thinking processes over time. So this is in Darwin's Notebook E. No one but a practiced geologist, which he considered himself, by the way. He considered himself a geologist, not a biologist. No one but a practiced geologist can really comprehend how old the world is, as the measurements refer not to the revolutions of the sun and our lives. He also understood the importance of geologic change and a related concept, isolation. You don't need to write down his quote, but I'll show you more text in a bit. Change in external conditions, so environmental change around you, and isolation either by chance landing of a form on an island, or subsidence that is sinking, dividing a continent, or a great chain of mountains coming up. And the number of individuals not being numerous will best favor variation selection. Barrier would further act in preventing species formed in one part from migrating to another part. So again, Darwin and Wallace were writing and thinking in a time when we were beginning to understand the scale of geologic change throughout Earth history, and as a consequence, environmental change. And so the possibility that one population might be subdivided, isolating the two populations, was recognized. And if you isolate these separate breeding populations, what was once one species is now potentially under two different selective regimes, different pressures of selection. And therefore, given time, they can diverge from each other. So in this case, we have a cartoon where a tortoise species on an island or some landmass of some sort, the same habitat all across. These guys are all interbreeding with each other. But the rise of a mountain change separates the breeding population. The environments change due to what's called a rain-shadowed desert, or also rain-shadowed grassland. And then, because they're in a new regime, one population begins to adapt to new conditions, and therefore changes from the old form. So, Darwin and Wallace began to realize the implications of natural selection. As I said, they both started by the recognition that it's comparable to artificial selection, it's comparable to domestication. But unlike domestication, in which we can, because we are controlling and indeed protecting the organisms, favor just a small set of traits over all others, an individual in the wild has to survive, and therefore natural selection will operate on all traits and not just a few. Consequently, and additionally, because we can absolutely control the breeding of plants or animals that we're domesticating, but nature doesn't have that sort of absolute control, it takes a lot longer for these changes to occur. It's on geologic timescales, and not just the few generations that an agronomer or a pigeon fancier, an agronomist or a pigeon fancier or a dog breeder can transform a population. And this most important thing, evolution doesn't occur to individuals. No individual evolves. It occurs to populations, or more specifically, lineages. So extending a population through time. Okay. So there are a bunch of different patterns, we call evolutionary patterns, that occur in evolution. Many of which really manifest not within a species, but rather the accumulation of changes of a lineage of species through time. So I'm going to talk now about some of these evolutionary patterns that we'll see play out later on in dinosaurs and their relatives. The first of these didn't get a name really until the later 20th century, although people have been talking about the concept since the early days. And it's what we call correlated progression. And it's the successive accumulation of traits for some general mode of life. And the idea here is that mutations, or new traits, that work together tend to survive together. But if you get variations where they have a set of traits that don't work well together, those ones with that combination tend to die off. And this is evolution as the public normally thinks about that. What you see behind me is a set of graphs, or photographs showing the evolution of horses, at least down from a lineage to the modern horse, from an early horse member that still had multiple toes, 3 toes. You see the metatarsals 2 and 4. So horses stand, modern horses only have metatarsal and metacarpal 1. They stand on 3. They stand on digit 3, the middle finger and the middle toe. Their ancestors had 5 toes, and then 4 toes, and then 3 toes, and then 1 toe. And what you see highlighted in pink as it goes by again are the metatarsals on the side as they get reduced because they're no longer weight-bearing. They're becoming first effectively and then actually monodactyl, single-toed. Similarly, you can see the photographs are to scale in size. Horses are getting bigger over time. Additionally, their jaws are getting proportionally deeper, and they don't show it here. The teeth are getting higher and more complex crowns. All of these adaptations helped the horse lineage, or at least the lineage that leads to modern horses, Equus, survive as they moved from being woodland, small, browsing animals to big, open grassland, running grazers. So that's one pattern. Another pattern, common ancestry and divergence. In fact, these will be important patterns for most of this course, as we'll see. So Darwin and Wallace, unlike earlier generations of transmutationists, I didn't go into this, but some of the earlier folks, like Erasmus Darwin and Lamarck, didn't think all life had a single origin. They thought life kept on coming into being separately for different lineages. But Darwin and Wallace argued that all lineages of organisms share a common ancestor, and that this ancestor would diverge, would split over time due to the differential success and adaptations or extinctions of individual branches. And so consequently, Darwin compared the pattern of the diversity and diversification of life to a tree of life, which is sort of an older metaphor. And he notes in his notebook, and I think this is kind of cool, given what he's thinking about here, the tree of life should perhaps be called the coral of life, because the bases of the branch are dead, and at that point we go further, and preserved as stone. Because the earlier part of a coral, which is an animal, the animal lives on the outside of the coral, and it produces its branching structure, and preserved in stone. So what you see here actually was one of the first attempts to do a family tree of organisms by the guy who coins the word phylogeny, among many other words. We'll get to that in a bit. Showing animals, protists, and plants, and their interrelationship over time. So, how does this divergence happen? Well, I showed you in principle the idea of geographic isolation being away, but in more general principle, divergence is when a single ancestor has two or more different descendant lineages that are distinct from each other. And it turns out this is a very common pattern in the history of life. So, we don't have the actual common ancestor of these two, but these two organisms, both about as long as 1.5 of these tables, if they stopped here, if there had been no success of either of these lineages, I think any vertebrate paleontologist would have called these two members of the same family or whatever, some same group, and close relatives, maybe different genera in that group, but clearly similar to each other. So I showed you about the length. I could tell you that these are semi-aquatic mammals. That is, they lived on land, but they also would go into the water. They have descendants today. Anyone want to take a stab, if you haven't had one of my lectures before with a slide in it, as to what their descendants are? Yes? Crocodiles? No. I'll tell you these are mammals. Go for it. Platypus? No, not in fact. Yes, back there.
I was going to say platypus.
Okay, how about over here?
Whales?
Not whales, but good guess. How about up there?
Hippos?
Ecologically similar, but they're actually not hippos. Anyone else? Over here.
Otters?
Otters, good guess, but no. Yes, one more.
Elephant?
Ooh, one of these is a proto-elephant. Anyone want to take a stab at what the other animal is? Manatee, absolutely. Yes. So, as it turns out, in the living world, manatees and dugongs, the other sea cow, and elephants are each other's closest relatives. But they don't look anything like each other now. But you go back in time, and their ancestors were extremely close. But what happened is, the sea cow lineage became progressively more aquatic. So correlated progression favored an aquatic lifestyle. They lost their hind limbs and so forth. Both groups here actually began with a set of tiny tusks in the upper and lower jaw. In the elephant lineage, they went back to being emphasizing the terrestrial life habit. Although to be fair, elephants are actually really good swimmers. Early members of this lineage had 4 tusks. They retained the upper and lower jaw. Some extinct branches lost the upper tusks, but kept the lower ones. But the surviving part of this lineage only keeps the upper tusks. So we have divergence, and even within one divergence, we get multiple divergence, and so on and so forth. And that's actually true on the manatee side. So things that now look very different from each other, when we trace their history back, we see that it was differential fate, differential adaptations in the different lineages that produced the very different present-day forms. I won't say final forms, because with luck and conservation efforts, these won't be the final forms of these different disparate lineages. So to show you how this might happen without necessarily geographic isolation, let's say again we have this ancestral population of hoofed mammals in Africa where, as I had the example last time, the big guys preferentially survive. But let's say the little guys preferentially survive because they can hide more easily and they need less food. Well, over time, the middle forms preferentially do not survive. The more extreme members in the opposite directions tend to survive better. At this point, we can still see that there are living members of the population that grade from one to the other. And as we saw, many living species have these fuzzy boundaries of gradation. But over sufficient time, they will be so different from each other that interbreeding will be difficult, if not ultimately impossible. And what was once one population, because of differential selection among different members of the population, has become multiple ones. So it's worth noting that although the public tends to think about evolution just as correlated progression, what we're actually seeing in correlated progression is divergence, but what you're doing is you're taking one end member and tracing back through time the history of that lineage. But you could potentially have gone from these early members and gone up a different branch and seen a different history. And here we see sort of the accumulation of correlated progression and divergence in the history of whales. So someone over here was picking up whales before, and indeed whales did start as four-legged terrestrial mammals, just a different sort. Another pattern of evolution we call adaptive radiations. And again, we can go back to Darwin talking about this, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds. One might really fancy that from an original paucity, scarcity of birds in this archipelago, the Galapagos, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. And what he's talking about are the finches of the Galapagos, where from a single finch population ancestor, there was the geologically rapid divergence into many different types of lifestyles, which back on the mainland would be occupied by different birds. So some act like woodpeckers, some act pretty much like continental finches, some are seed crackers, and so on and so forth. So this pattern of an adaptive radiation is not merely a divergence, but a rapid divergence into many different forms. That's the idea of the radiation. It's rapid into many different forms, many branches coming out. And so think of the rays coming out of that. And it's an adaptive radiation because these many different branches are living in some drastically different way from each other. Adaptive radiations might arise due to the evolution of a new trait. We'll see examples of that coming up, but this is a good example, the ability to lay an egg on land. Or access to a new environment. That's what happened to the finches in the Galapagos. There were no native songbirds there because those were volcanic islands. They got blown off there. And in this new environment, they didn't have any competition, except from each other. Or the classic example, in fact, this is the classic example I'm showing you here. Adaptive radiation was coined in the concept of this. With the extinction of large-bodied dinosaurs 66 million years ago, placental mammals, which had already been around, radiated very quickly into a variety of new forms. So the forms that had previously occupied those ways of life, those niches, the dinosaurs, were gone. And so now you had mammals becoming the large terrestrial herbivores, the large terrestrial carnivores, and so forth. So that's an adaptive radiation. Rapid divergence on a geologic time scale into many different forms. One of the things that can promote adaptive radiation, and something that is happening in general anyway, is what we call niche partitioning. So niche or niche, people say it both ways, is a way of life. It's an ecological way of life. The ancestral members of an adaptive radiation, because they represent one population, will compete for the same resources. In such a situation, the variations whose specializations are more extreme, that is more different from each other, will have greater success than those which are more mainstream, where there's a lot more competition. And so selection will tend over time to partition, that is, divide up the ways of accessing resources. We can even see that today. These are 3 different species of Darwin's finches. Each graph here is a different island or set of closely related islands. And on the islands where we have only one of the species, their beak size pretty much overlaps from one island to another, sort of a medium size. On those islands where there's two species, where two of them are represented, one of them gets partitioned as a little guy, and the other one is the larger one with a sort of a long tail coming out here in distribution. And the islands with three of them, they partition it up even more finely. And by doing so, you can have more species coexisting in the same spot, because each one is getting resources in a slightly different way. And we'll see examples of niche partitioning in dinosaur history. Now, a really common pattern, which surprisingly took a while for the modern name to show up, is exaptation. So remember, apt is to be fit, to be adapt is to be fit toward something. To be exaptation is to be fit from something or out of something. And people began to recognize early on in the history of paleontology and evolutionary biology that many organisms don't just evolve brand new traits. Instead, what they do is they have previously existing traits and attributes which become co-opted, used in a new way, and then modified for that new mode of life. People used to talk about this as pre-adaptation, and that's sort of a little metaphysical, or teleologically fraught. It suggests that that trait was hanging around waiting to be used for something. It was already being used for something. But then it began to be adapted for a new mode of life. For instance, our forelimbs, the forelimbs of terrestrial vertebrates, were originally the front fins of fish, and were perfectly good for swimming around. And then there were some freshwater fish which were using those front limbs to help push them through choked vegetation in things like streams and lakes. And they began to develop joints within those. From some of their descendants that had spent more time on land, those joints became even better developed. And the fin rays coming off of the fins became more bony. They became ultimately digits. And so our forelimb is exapted from what was once a front fin, a pectoral fin. Or we see that many of the types of dinosaurs, particularly small-bodied ones, had some sort of coating of a proto-feather, a fuzzy structure, which was perfectly functional for them, probably for a combination of display and insulation. But in at least one subgroup, those structures, which were adapted for the function of display and for insulation, became further modified, became exapted for an entirely new mode of life, and that is aerial locomotion, flight. That's a story we'll get to towards the end of the second section of the course. Now, we see in nature that there are many cases where different lineages of organisms wind up evolving very similar looking members. This is called convergence or convergent evolution, the independent evolution of the same traits in different lineages. And often this is a result of some sort of similar ecology. So for instance, tuna, dolphins, lemniform sharks, so the sharks that most people think about when we think about sharks, the ones that are celebrated in Shark Week, and the extinct ichthyosaurs have very similar body profiles, even to including this half-moon-shaped tail fluke, very tall triangular dorsal fins, very triangular pectoral fins, and so forth. And for the first three, we know that they are all high-speed, pelagic, that is open sea, hunters. They chase fast fish out in the open seas. And in fact, we can infer this for the ichthyosaurs, that they had a similar lifestyle because they had a similar profile. Now, the ancestors of tuna looked something more like herring. The ancestors of dolphins would have been the early whales, and before that, some four-legged terrestrial mammals. The ancestors of the lamniform sharks would have been something like a nurse shark. Oh, that's like a dogfishy-looking shark. And the ancestors of the fast-moving ichthyosaurs were more eel-like, and before that were four-legged terrestrial reptiles. But over time, they converge on the same solutions in terms of shape because meat and bone, or ossified cartilage in the case of the shark, can only operate a certain way, basically torpedo-shaped, if you want to go really fast in the water. Or we could see how these three different groups of terrestrial reptiles, this one a member of the proto-crocodiles, and these two members of the carnivorous dinosaur group. These three evolved a similar body form as they moved from being carnivores to omnivores and herbivores. They losed their teeth and got toothless beaks. They have small heads and long necks, better for poking around for vegetation. They no longer need to crunch down on the necks of victims. They lose pointy claws because they're no longer grabbing into victims, but they need longish legs because now, lacking those claws or big teeth, they're on the menu and they need to get away. This is a good thing. Convergence is a good thing in this context because it allows us to infer aspects of ecology of extinct organisms with certain caveats that we'll get to later on. We will see in the lecture on Wednesday that convergence, on the other hand, can be sometimes confounding in a different set of circumstances, and that is trying to reconstruct family relationships. Now, just a couple more of these evolutionary patterns to go. Coevolution. Most of what I've talked about so far has been talking about what goes on in one lineage. But of course, any organism lives in a world with other organisms. And the fact that one organism is evolving may actually produce evolution in other members of its ecosystem. So evolution in one set of species, let's say pollinators of flowers or prey items, results in evolutionary change in the group they interact with, the flowers or the predators, which leads to change in the first group, which leads to change in the second group, and so on and so forth. So in the case of predator-prey relationships, the prey might get faster, the predators evolve higher speed as well, the prey might evolve armor, the predators have to evolve some way of dealing with the armor or going extinct, In the case of these pollinators here, many types of flowers have specific species that are their primary pollinator, and that sort of guarantees that the pollen being delivered to them is the plant's own species. And so they evolve attributes that make them favorable to the particular features of that pollinator. So coevolution. Heterochrony. In the 19th century, people began to recognize that evolution doesn't just involve the origin of new traits, but sometimes it can involve change in the timing of the development of organisms. So here, for instance, we see an adult and a juvenile of a tiger salamander. The adult lives on land, although moist land. It breathes there. It's sexually mature. The juvenile lives in water. It breathes through gills, and it cannot reproduce. But from the tiger salamander, we evolved the axolotl. The axolotl has the morphology, has the form of a juvenile, but is sexually mature. It reproduces. It spends its entire life cycle as basically a kid, but a kid capable of reproducing. And so it evolved by changing the timing of the development of its body. So basically it stopped growing after a while, at least with regard to the general morphology. And people have pointed this out as an attribute that happens in pop culture. So we could see, for instance, the classic Warner Brothers characters, and people have created juvenilized versions of them. Okay, they are supposed to be different characters, but juvenilized features, and a horrible attempt, totally bombed, to do hyper-adult versions. And these reflect the two basic patterns of heterochrony, changing or differences in timing. So heterochrony can involve paedomorphosis. Paedomorphosis is evolution by adding traits towards the end, by exaggerating the adult traits in the descendant relative to the ancestor. So in all these cartoons, we'll have the ancestral growth series on the bottom, and then different examples, in this case of paedomorphosis, on top. You don't need to know the distinction in this class between hypermorphosis, acceleration, and predisplacement. There are 3 different pathways that paedomorphosis takes. But in all cases, the final form, the adult version of the descendant, is a superadult, a hyperadult, compared to the ancestor. But in the case of the axolotl, we were seeing an example of paedomorphosis. The same pedo as in pediatrics or other words that have pedo in it. So that means juvenile form. And in this case, the descendants have adults that look juvenilized compared to the ancestor, that retain juvenile traits one way or another. Again, there's 3 different pathways to get there, but we're not going to deal with that. So, paedomorphosis and paedomorphosis. Hyperadults versus juvenilized adults. And it's not an either-or thing, necessarily. Sometimes within one lineage, we can see some traits undergoing paedomorphosis and others undergoing paedomorphosis. And indeed, we are a great example of that. In terms of our skull form, we humans, so these are, let's say, a baby person and an adult skull. We have basically baby heads. We have short faces, we have relatively small jaws, and we have rounded skulls, like babies do, compared to our living cousins, the chimps, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and so forth. The skulls of the babies, both of a chimp and a human, are pretty similar, but in the chimp lineage, the lower face gets much bigger, the jaw gets proportionally bigger, the brain gets proportionally smaller and long. So we have baby faces. But with regard to things from sort of the shoulders down, and especially the hips down, we have paramorphically long legs. Baby humans and baby chimps have really small little legs. We grow into toddlers, and chimps grow into sort of toddlers. And then chimps basically stop at the toddler stage in terms of their hind legs. But when we hit adolescence, our legs become really long. And that actually reflects something about our own evolutionary history. Our own lineage has a history where we became open land, fast-moving, and especially high-endurance runners. And the final pattern I'll look at here is mass extinctions. Sort of, in some ways, you might think, why is extinction an evolutionary pattern? It's the end of evolution for the lineages that go extinct, but it's an opportunity for everyone else. So mass extinctions are the geologically rapid disappearance of many groups. We'll have a more precise definition in the second to last week of the course. But these rapid disappearance of many groups leaves holes in the ecosystems, unfilled niches. And it promotes evolutionary changes, including and especially adaptive radiation. And we will see, starting on Friday and continuing in many other parts of the course, how mass extinctions, different mass extinctions in the history of life, take out the old players and allow new players to take on roles. So if we went back to the late Cretaceous, we would find giant marine reptiles. We would find on land that dinosaurs were the primary herbivores and carnivores at medium to large body size, and that mammals were present, but only as the small-bodied form. But then, after the worst day in the history of the planet, these guys get wiped out, and over the course of the next several million years, these mammals radiate out and to occupy these old niches. Now, the majority of mammals retain small body size, But some became big terrestrial carnivores, some became big terrestrial herbivores, and some even replaced the marine reptiles in the apex of the marine ecosystems. Okay, so that gets us through evolutionary patterns, but we're now going to continue. We'll start the lecture that continues on to Wednesday, which is look at in one of these patterns in greater detail, and it's one we'll be using throughout the rest of the course. And this is the idea of phylogenetics, reconstructing the tree of life. So we saw this metaphor of the tree of life, the common ancestor branching, and those branches branching, and so on and so forth. We also saw, when I talked about taxonomy last week, that there were these Linnaean ranks. So here's the ginkgo biloba, Desmodus rotundus, or the vampire bat, and Tyrannosaurus rex. And as I talked about, what do these Linnaean ranks mean? Are they the number of species? No. I did the slide before. So morphological disparity? No. You can have an order of mammals with only one living species. We could have an order of beetles with more species than vertebrates have. Age of origin? No. What does it mean? The ranks themselves, as we saw, mean nothing. They're just bookkeeping. But the taxa in there might mean something. The named group, like, Ginkgoales or Saurischia or what have you. And so we're going to move from purely taxonomy to the realm of what we call systematics. Not simply placing groups within groups within groups, but having principles for so doing. So systematics, the principles for organizing taxa. What is our justification for recognizing Panthera and Felidae and Carnivora and Mammalia and Chordata and Animalia and so forth? Now, in Linnaean systematics, it was simple. Classification was based on overall similarity. Those might be really fine-tuned similarities at the level of, say, Felidae or Panthera pardus, or they might be more general similarities at a higher order. And that remains useful. I won't say that it's useless. After all, most field guides are based on that. And in so doing, you can classify. You can put into a list any taxon, to some degree, and you can retrieve that information. It does its job in that context. So for here, for instance, we see the three classes, as traditionally recognized, of terrestrial vertebrates, or fully terrestrial vertebrates. We've got Mammalia, that's the mammals. We are warm-blooded, we're furry, we give milk, and our forelimbs are arms, unless they're flippers, or we've lost them. And then there's Reptilia, with its subdivisions. Testudines, go terps, those are the turtles, and, the turtles for English, for American, for the Brits in the audience, turtles, tortoises, and terrapins. We use the generic term turtle for all Testudines. Or also the lepidosaurs, snakes and other lizards, and tuataras, and crocodilia, alligators, crocs, gharials, caimans. And they're cold-blooded, and they're scaly, and they do not give milk, and they have arms unless they have flippers or nothing in the case of snakes. And then there's birds, aves. Aves are warm-blooded, they're feathery, they do not give milk, and they have wings unless they have flippers like in penguins or nothing like a moa. And this works to some degree, but using the information I told you, using traditional systematics, could you answer this question? Which of these two are most closely related to each other? Reptilia and aves, Reptilia and Mammalia, aves and Mammalia, they're all equally closely related, or it does not say. And just to save us a little time, it doesn't say. They are equal ranks, but does that really tell us that they're equally closely related to each other? No, it doesn't contain that information. But what if it could? What if we had a system that encoded information about evolutionary relationships and made that the focus of our classification? We'll pick up this story next time and wrap up systematics. So Take care, and see you guys later. And if you didn't, make sure you got the QR code scanned in.